Okay, hey everyone. I wanted to put this session together. It was actually a session that I did for a Veeam User Group in the UK, but I've been asked over the last couple of weeks about what it is that I'm actually focused on. So I wanted to highlight some of the areas where Veeam actually cover today, and it's not just about virtualization. However, a lot of it still is because, as you all know, that's where we're running some of the most important workloads that we have in our data centers, but also in the cloud. So title of the session is Virtualization Was Just the Start. I'm Michael Cade. I'm a field CTO here at Veeam. I've been here for 9.5 years now. So as we've built out this Veeam Data Platform from a couple of products that were really just focused on virtualization, we've now got a complete platform that looks after all of the different platforms that you run your workloads and your data on. So, and we're going to get into a bit of that as we go through. And really the key aspect of this session is about raising awareness of what it is we actually cover, not necessarily how we cover. I think there's an element to another follow-up session to that as well. So what are we going to get into in this session is, one, what is the Veeam Data Platform? What does it mean? We're going to talk about data being everywhere, like as I just mentioned. No longer are we just in a data center using physical and virtual machines. We now leverage SaaS, we leverage cloud-based services such as PaaS, IaaS. We use service providers. There's lots of different areas. And then where are we at from a Veeam in 2024? And remember, this is from my perspective. And I'm going to steer away from the security side ever so slightly. Because I want to talk about actually what we're protecting and why we're protecting that. Okay, so the Veeam Data Platform. When I first started, we were pretty much focused on virtualization backup and actually vSphere, VMware vSphere, as well as Microsoft Hyper-V. And this was one of our platform slides, if you will. So being able to backup, replicate, and recover those workloads. Now, what were those workloads? We might have had Active Directory. Some of you might still have that running as virtual machines, as physical machines in your environment. Email, Microsoft Exchange. We might have some databases, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, etc. We might then have additional applications. We most likely did have other applications, whether it be commercial off-the-shelf software, something that you've built, and then there's the web front ends that you may have had for your internal website. And then you've got file and print servers where you're storing your mission critical unstructured data, right? All in your virtualization, little cluster, little isolated environment that would give you all of these fantastic services that we had 10 plus years ago. Now, when we look at Veeam from a data platform perspective, as well as your own, is that we don't just have that virtual environment anymore, that vSphere, that Microsoft Hyper-V. We might still, in fact, I'm pretty confident that we all still run some level of virtualization. But equally, we've expanded out to all these other different platforms, such as the cloud, both physical enterprise applications, like being able to dive into that application, speak that application language, and be able to provide an interface between that so that both infrastructure operations and backup admins and DBAs can have visibility, and we're all rowing the same way, if you will. And then the explosion of SaaS-based workloads, Microsoft 365, I would say 90% of the customers that I speak to have migrated from Exchange into Microsoft 365. And then something that we use closely in Veeam is our Salesforce system to store important information. So let's build on this a little bit. So the Veeam Data Platform today in 2024. So this is the ability for you to download or to deploy your own Veeam infrastructure, your own Veeam environment in any of these locations to be able to protect said location in the most native and efficient way. So as you can see, there's a long list here. So cloud, we're protecting workloads in AWS, Azure, Google. I'm going to get into that in a lot more detail later. Equally around Kubernetes. So we acquired a company very fastly approaching October 4 years ago, called Kasten. Veeam Kasten for Kubernetes is our native way about being able to protect workloads in Kubernetes, including virtual machines on OpenShift virtualization or Red Hat OpenShift virtualization or OCPV. And then we see other workloads such as object storage, where we're now not just using object storage as a backup location, but people are using object storage for unstructured data use cases. I will add there is that this is not the most up-to-date marketing slide. So we could almost add another one on there, which is focused around Azure Data Lake, which, again, when we look at data pipelines, we look at big data, we might be using a data lake in Azure to be able to feed that structured, unstructured, semi-structured data into. Does that need protecting? We have customers that were asking for that capability. So just adding that again in the last couple of weeks, the ability to protect Azure Data Lake. Then we move on to virtualization. If you remember, we started off with VMware vSphere and then Microsoft Hyper-V. We've already had the capability for the last at least 3, 4, 5 years to protect Nutanix HV. Red Hat virtualization came next. Oracle Linux KVM. And then again in that most recent update was the ability to protect Proxmox as another hypervisor. So an ever-expanding virtualization was the start, or was just the start. As you can see, virtualization hasn't and will not, in my opinion, go away. So we need to go where our customers are wanting to protect those workloads. From a physical point of view, again, Veeam actually said we would never support physical workloads, but clearly physical also hasn't gone away. Systems, whether that be today's systems around Windows and Linux, whether that be endpoint protection or whether that be servers that rely on being physical because of additional hardware, but equally around being able to protect a fleet of Mac OS systems, more legacy systems around Unix, Solaris, etc. And then that unstructured data. A lot of us will have a shared NAS device, which is offering out SMB or NFS. How do we protect those workloads? And then we get into enterprise applications. So whether that be Microsoft SQL, Oracle, and this is where I was saying about bringing that all together. Like traditionally we would have an Oracle DBA and they would have the rights to protect using RMAN. They would potentially write their backups to the same server that they're working on, not to a shared device. But ultimately, whatever they were doing, whether wrong or right, is that the backup admin had no visibility of that, or the infrastructure admin had no visibility of that. So we wrote plugins that enabled everyone to have access to secure, efficient storage backed by Veeam, and then the ability for the DBA to do what they need to do without changing their workflow, without have to settle for what the backup admin was telling them, even though the backup admin likely didn't have the knowledge of the database system. So we've brought that out for Microsoft SQL, and that's the ability to have a Veeam plugin inside SQL Management Studio. Oracle RMAN and SAP HANA have been there for a while. The ability to protect Postgres. Again, in this most recent release, the ability to protect MongoDB and then provide the explorers into those workloads. And then finally, before we get on and get into a little bit more detail, is around those SaaS-based workloads. People are willing to offload a lot of that headache and administration off to just letting us consume the service. And if you've all seen the pizza analogy, is that how do you can build your own pizza at home and you look after it from making the dough to cooking it in the oven, blah blah blah, and then as you progressively move more towards SaaS at one other end, is you're offloading parts of that responsibility. Like if you go to a shop and buy a pizza, if you order one in from a delivery place, if you just literally go to a shop, consume the pizza, then that's where you're getting more into the SaaS. So Veeam Data Platform, protected workloads. Again, this is an older slide, but this just goes the breadth of what we've done over the last 6-7 years, is the ability to meet our customers, meet our prospects where they where they're going, whether that be from a virtual point of view, a SaaS point of view, a cloud point of view, all of the other areas, and being able to protect those workloads throughout this Veeam platform. So data is everywhere. We all know this. Like, we might have data inside of our data center, and we've never gone outside of that into the public cloud. I beg to differ. We see reports from analysts that data is exploding. It has been since the pandemic. The pandemic actually was a catalyst for being able to have data outside of that data center. Blowing up the four walls of the data center was an article piece that I was quoted in during the pandemic, because we needed the data to be as close to our users as we possibly could. Users being the people that work in our company, or the consumers of that data. So insert some data stat showing that data is everywhere. I think you all realize that the data is literally everywhere, whether it be on-prem, whether it be in the cloud, whether it be on our workstations, unstructured data. You see NAS devices up in the cloud, like EFS, for example, within Amazon. We see Data Lake within Azure. We see other different platforms around Kubernetes and serverless approaches. Ultimately, it's hard to imagine an application that doesn't have some data tied to it. And I don't want to get onto too much of a rant about the Kubernetes state of Kubernetes at the moment, but that very much started as this is a stateless platform, and that's fine in terms of I'm going to run my application here. It's going to scale up, it's going to scale out accordingly to the application that we have and the environment that we also have. But that application, it's hard to imagine that application did not have some sort of database attached to it from day zero. I.e., that could be just authentication. Authentication lives somewhere, whether that's you managing the authentication with something like Active Directory, or whether that be more like a PAS-based authentication system such as Entra ID. That's still data. Then start adding on the ability to where does your content, where does your catalog sit, where does your order processing sit? It's going to sit on a database, and just because it's not inside the Kubernetes cluster per se, however, we are seeing a rise in the amount of databases we see within Kubernetes. It's attached to it. We still have to think about the application more and more as we evolve into these other platforms, and things are tied together a lot more than they were where we were just using a distributed switch to connect all of our different virtual machines together to get our overall set of application servers. So when it comes to Veeam, there's three areas that we generally touch on. That's security, recovery, and freedom. Again, this is a little bit outdated, because I would also add that we also need to think about overarching. The data is still the 100% middle, the most important part here. And off that, we should also include the backup, because there's ways in which you can, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I.e., I can use potentially an image-based backup tool to back up my Kubernetes cluster. But ultimately, that's not going to help when it comes to data recovery. We need to be natively aware of what we're protecting. So I would argue that our new story, our new messaging around data being in the middle, or more importantly, data resilience, is then surrounded by data backup, data recovery, data security, data freedom, and then equally important is, okay, how can we do something with all this data that we're protecting with data intelligence? But the three that I want to touch on here are really around security, recovery, and freedom. Just know that this all starts with backup. We have to be native. We have to be application aware. And I mean aware at the application level versus application awareness in terms of VSS and consistency. But if we start with recovery, because backup is generally easy. There's a whole area that I could go into, though, where I'd completely contradict myself saying about backup being easy, because ultimately, with the amount of platforms that we have available to us, we have to make sure that we're using the right tool for the right job. Like, can I get a screw into a bolt using a hammer? I would beg that, yeah, I can, but that's probably not the right tool, right? We should use a spanner to get that in there. But anyway, I digress. From a data recovery point of view, Veeam has been pioneering the ability to instantly recover. So the ability to instantly recover a virtual machine back into its same location or into another. We have instant VM recovery into various different hypervisors, VMware, Hyper-V, Nutanix, AHV, etc. And the ability to take any image-based backup that we have and be able to restore that instantly into those environments. So we also have that from a NAS perspective. If you were running an enterprise NAS and that enterprise NAS died and we have a backup, we could present that NAS backup as a writable share to your users to be able to at least work, get that delta, and then when that enterprise SAN comes up, we can restore everything back into that with the delta change that we have since the last backup. We also have it from a Kubernetes point of view. If you're running Kubernetes on vSphere, on a VMware environment, not necessarily just Tanzu, and you're using the vSphere CSI, and you're protecting your workload to a Veeam repository, we have the ability to instantly recover those first-class disks back into the environment. Okay, so granular recovery. Obviously, it's relatively easy to do a full backup and a full recovery. That's going to take a lot of time, especially when you start piling on the amount and the capacity that we have. So being able to go in and restore what you want when you need it, i.e. different application items, file level recovery, we have the ability to do that via our Veeam Explorers across the park as well. So another key important part when it comes to data recovery. Extending that out to databases. So we have Veeam Explorers not only for Active Directory and for SharePoint, which I'd slowly see go away and more PaaS and SaaS-based offerings are happening, Microsoft 365 being one of those, Entra ID being another, but we still see a large amount of Microsoft SQL, Oracle, Postgres, MongoDB from a NoSQL perspective, running inside that virtual machine. Now, what we have to complement that granular recovery are the Veeam Explorers. The Veeam Explorers for these databases allow us to go in and take a granular look inside of all of the databases that may be on that one database server and actually roll those back, just individual, either those databases, collections, tables, etc. But it gives you a much more granular approach into recovering those databases. And then finally, a big fan of what we've done around the recoverability of that data. And actually, this is moved more into the intelligence story. However, I think it's very important from a recovery point of view. We can all hope that when we come to recover any particular data, whether it's from an absolute disaster or whether it's just because someone has deleted something and made a mistake, I want to know. I don't want to just have hope as a strategy. I want to make sure that I have a verified backup point in time that I can restore to. And that's where our Sure Backup, Sure Replica comes in to be able to ensure that we've backed up and then verified that backup is recoverable from that perspective. And what we've done over the last couple of years on top of Sure Backup is Sure Backup used to, and well, still does if you want to use it this way, it allows you to test against the VM, the OS, and the app, and then sends an automated restore. The key element to that, if you've got thousands of VMs and you want to test them all against each other, you require the same resources for that. Now, you could do that in a DR site and you could do it wherever you need to. Great. However, that's a lot of resource to sit there idling whilst just wanting to test, and that might be outside of the budget constraints that you have within the business. We've implemented Sure Backup Lite, which allows us to do that same level of consistency check against those systems. Also, be able to do it randomly against those bulk of VMs, and then also give you some sort of report back to say we've tested these VMs. Then we move on to security. It goes without saying that everyone in 2024 should be sending their backups to an immutable target. An immutable target being an S3 or object storage capable of some sort of versioning and object lock type API, whether that be Azure Blob, whether it be AWS S3 using their object lock API, whether it be an S3 compatible, or what we've got around the hardened Linux repository. And watch this space. There's some really, really interesting, cool stuff coming around that hardened Linux repository to get up and running. But very much the first and foremost is keeping that data as protected as possible. The backup admin cannot even tamper with that. We also, as part of that restore process, if you're familiar with what we do, we can inject a process where we run a secure or an antivirus scan against our backups as they're being restored, so you're not implementing bad things back into your production environment. Obviously, we've worked very hard in the field listening to our customers around best practices. bp.veeam.com, I think it is where you're going to find all of those field stories that tell you how to implement the Veeam products. Another new thing, or actually not that new, beginning of the year, end of last 2023, 2024, was the ability to have these Yara inline scanning. So as we're taking backups, we've always had the ability to do that. Obviously, it takes an extra bit of load, a little bit of extra time, but Yara, being able to scan those files against Yara rules, gives you an inkling as to whether one of your backups is infected from the off. And being able to leverage that process gives you, again, having that awareness up front means that you can act upon that before bad things happen. And then over the last couple of months, we've worked a lot with best of breed security vendors versus us building our own. We've worked with some pretty big vendors out there, Sophos, some big Seam integrations, about being able to provide Veeam data up into those environments. And then more importantly, they allow us to integrate into something that we have called the incident API, which is about triggering when bad things happen, or a warning shot to say, this looks like it could be bad, so that you can then act upon that within your environment. And then freedom, probably the most topical item that I'm speaking to customers about today is around data freedom. And what do we mean by freedom? First and foremost, it means mobility. It means portability of that data. So whether you're running on VMware vSphere and you've got hundreds of virtual machines and you've got a case where you need to move those either from a test and dev, from a let's see what they look like here, or a full-blown migration from one hypervisor to another. Mobility gives us the ability to move that workload, directly restore that workload into that other location. You could also tie in that instant recovery capability to speed up that process. Ultimately, though, yes, instant recovery is a great way about being able to bring virtual machines from one hypervisor to another if need be, if bad things have happened. But you still have to wait for the storage to catch up. You have to still use vMotion or live migration to bring that data back into a more performant storage and not your backup. Being able to leverage that data, I've spoken about Sure Backup to verify the recoverability. What about being able to spin up a subset of VMs in an isolated environment and be able to test something against that, whether it be a patch update, whether it be some pen testing against that particular workload. The ability to leverage that data using Veeam Data Labs, still going strong, being able to run that in our environment. The other part is around that file format. Any image-based backup that we take, if I was able to show you that data platform again, anything that we take from an image-based backup perspective, so that be any of those virtualization platforms that I touched on, any of the physical Windows and Linux, also the cloud VMs, so Amazon EC2, Azure Virtual Machines and Google Cloud Compute, they all are protected into what we call a .vbk format. And that .vbk format is a bit like a .rar or a .zip file that we've seen forever in our industry, right? Being able to take a zipped up compressed file from Windows and have that on our Mac machine or on our Linux box as well, and vice versa. The VBK format, that's what really enables us to have that portability story amongst our machines. Which obviously, the freedom of choice is really the key aspect here. The ability to restore when bad things have happened to any location is really the key part to all of this. The ability to move from one to another, whether it be cloud to virtualization, virtualization to cloud, virtualization to another virtualization. All of these are options that we can have, and it doesn't have to be a lift and shift type scenario. This could be I want to see what these VMs look like in that setting. So Veeam does a lot in the cloud as well, and I've just touched on like the top tier of where we are in terms of protecting virtual machines in the cloud. But I feel like there's a huge part of the raising awareness here is actually we do a hell of a lot in the cloud, and we have done for the last several years since we started bringing out the Veeam backup for AWS, Veeam backup for Microsoft Azure, Veeam backup for Google Cloud. So let's initially just touch on these areas, and this is actually where my focus is around anything AWS, Azure, Google, as well as Kubernetes. You could split that Kubernetes out into Red Hat as well, but equally we see a lot of Kubernetes on-prem and in those public cloud with the managed services that they have, and then also object storage. And we can add a few more things on there as we go along, whether it be Azure Data Lake. We could add in Entra ID as we get round to 12.3 being released. All of these are cloud-based workloads, and I see them all tying in to that whole Veeam offering that we have where we roll our own. So from an AWS point of view, and I'm quickly going to do this, I think there is a let me know if you think this is useful to cover off in another video where, so Amazon EC2 should be pretty straightforward. That's a virtual machine that lives inside of Amazon, or the Amazon cloud, the AWS cloud and region. And ultimately, you've got the ability to provision that virtual machine, you give it its name, you set up your networking, but ultimately you don't care about the underbelly of that. You don't care you might care where it is in terms of region, but you can't walk up to the physical server that is running that virtual machine. That's offloaded. You're now paying Amazon for that privilege of being able to concentrate on more important things. Similar when it comes to unstructured data, we have Amazon EFS, so the Elastic File System. This is going to be a NAS in Amazon where you can store unstructured data for your workloads, for your environment. The virtual private cloud is, think about this as your networking stack within the cloud. This is what gives us the ability to interact within the cloud, but also from external to the cloud if you're running that hybrid multi-cloud type approach. This is what handles that layer of that. Then you might go one step further, and to touch on EC2, what workloads are we seeing in EC2? It could range from application servers, exactly what we saw or what we see in virtualization on-prem. But equally, I'm seeing customers lift and shift their database servers, their Oracle clusters, their Microsoft SQL Server into EC2 because they want control. They want to be able to have complete control from operating system all the way up or all the way down into the database layer, which then leads on, but there's a lot that don't do that, and they want to offload the operating system, the patching, the updates, etc. They just want to consume a database as a service or a PaaS-based database, such as Amazon RDS. And there's a whole, it's easy for me to say Amazon RDS, Relational Database Service, so your SQL databases. It's easy to say that. There's obviously different variants underneath that, like Oracle, Postgres, etc. Then we get into DynamoDB, another database type. Again, offloading that admin overhead of having to look after the operating system and some of the application that is hosting that database. We've then got Amazon S3. And like I mentioned, Amazon S3 is a great way to store your backups as well. But equally, we're seeing a large input of people using Amazon S3 as the production data store. So we need to be able to protect that, which we can within the data platform. EKS, so this is their managed Kubernetes service. We could also add ROSA on here, which is Red Hat OpenShift on AWS. And this gives us the ability to protect workloads, data, applications that live within that Kubernetes cluster. We're on the marketplace. We do some fantastic things there. And if that's the case, we have a product called Veeam Custom for Kubernetes, which is installed on the Kubernetes cluster, and it natively speaks to that Kubernetes API, becomes part of that Kubernetes API, and allows us to protect that. Up in the top right, the most recent areas of focus for the teams is one on Redshift. So think about your big data, think about your data warehousing, Redshift being able to protect that as a service, as well as FSX. And it's on the same line as the EFS, because FSX, again, has a tree underneath it that we support around things like Gluster and other areas, not the ONTAP piece, not from NetApp, but it gives us some more bells and whistles, or more as a consumer of FSX, it gives us some additional features that we don't get in EFS. So being able to protect that using Veeam is obviously very important as well. So yeah, let me know if you'd want me to go through in a little bit more detail how to get started, what that means, all of that good stuff. When we switch to Azure, very similar. We've got our Azure VMs, so virtual machines, again, living in Azure though this time. Again, offloading that responsibility down into Azure and paying for that. Then you've got Azure SQL databases, much like RDS in that light. Again, we can go into more detail about that. Then Azure Virtual Network Configuration. It's very blasé of me to say this is very similar to VPC. However, it is a lot like that. Again, we can go into more detail. Azure File Shares. Again, this is again where we'd store our unstructured data. Azure Blob Storage being your object storage. Again, using it for production. I will add as well, I haven't added on Azure Data Lake. It literally came out last week. AKS, which is their Azure Kubernetes service. They also have Azure, or ARO, which is Azure Red Hat OpenShift as well, which again is the managed service on Azure. And then Cosmos DB. So again, another database type that we have within Azure, and being able to protect those. When it comes to Google, I'll be really interested. I'm a big fan of what Google Cloud looks like. I just see less and less of it from a European perspective. But I know that a lot of net new greenfield companies they go Google first. I would love to understand where we need to go to be able to protect more of those data services. So again, they have Google Compute Engine, which is their virtual machines. They have Google Cloud SQL. They have Google Cloud Spanner, and they have Google Cloud Storage, which is their object storage offering. And they have GKE. I'm not aware if there is a Red Hat version in there. I'm sure there is. I'm just not familiar with that, as I've not seen it. All of these products or features that we have built into these appliances that we deploy out into a specific area within your Azure account when it comes to VDP. So when it comes to then Kubernetes as a final step, from a Kubernetes distribution, I mentioned things like EKS, GKE, AKS, ROSA, etc. But obviously Kubernetes is like the cloud operating system. It can pretty much run anywhere. You can run it on-prem, you can run it on bare metal, you can run it on physical, you can run your own EC2 instance, times that by 5, 3, 10, whatever. You could go and roll your own Kubernetes cluster up there. We don't, from a support point of view, when it comes to Veeam Custom for Kubernetes, we don't really care, as long as you're using a supported version of Kubernetes and the distribution, we don't really mind. Same for that storage infrastructure. I would say that the only thing that we do look for is that CSI driver, making sure that the native storage the storage that you're using has an up-to-date CSI driver. We've listed a couple there that we work with, as well as the cloud storage that we talked about. One thing I will say is that we're seeing a lot more data services being rolled into Kubernetes over the last 12 to 18 months. MongoDB, Postgres, we're seeing operators such as K8 Sandra, we're seeing EDB do the same, SQL, Cassandra, anything that really holds that persistent data. If you're running PVCs in Kubernetes, why? And ultimately that probably ensures that data is probably important. It's no longer ephemeral at that point, so you probably need to protect it. Finally, before I get on to some of the other key areas here, is being able to integrate into the best of breed security services again on this platform, on Kubernetes. Being able to leverage Kyverno and OPA for policy guardrails, making sure that when our developers are deploying applications into our clusters, making sure that if there is a PVC, okay, let's make sure that we're protecting it with a catch-all policy within Kasten. Being able to leverage Vault from a secrets management perspective, being able to use native Red Hat and AWS services in there. The one thing I would say about Veeam Kasten, and the backup is one bit, it's almost a byproduct. The most important part here is the freedom, is the ability to move an application and its data from one Kubernetes distribution to another. And that might be, we started on-prem using KubeADM to build our own Kubernetes cluster. And now we've grown up, we've got some mission critical applications in there, we're now going to EKS, or we're going to ROSA, or we're going to AKS, etc. That process to be able to lift and shift that manually becomes a bit of a headache, a bit of a pain. Now, don't get me wrong, the application itself should be relatively easy. It should be stored in some sort of Git repository and you should be able to restore that, deploy that, no worries. Where it does get quite complicated is the ability to restore those PVCs and transform what that looks like. And that's a big, big area that we differentiate in this world of Kubernetes. Kasten gives us the ability to restore and transform what that application needs to look like. And that could be the storage, but equally it could be around scaling up your application to see what it looks like. It could be a whole plethora of things. Okay, so Veeam in 2024. The other area, so everything I've spoke to up until now has been you roll it yourself, Mr. Customer, or Mr. End User, or Mrs. End User, and you're in control. Obviously, there's support agreements and all of that good stuff, but you're the guardian of your data. You're in charge of setting your policies when they need to happen, all of that good stuff. Probably around 12 months, coming up 12 months ago, we created our own first-party SaaS solution called the Veeam Data Cloud. And the Veeam Data Cloud is a Veeam solution where we offload some of that responsibility. Now, let me be clear on where we sit, in that we have 3 different ways in which you can choose to use Veeam. That could be the Veeam Data Platform. You do it all. You look after it. You set and forget your SLAs. We have our own Veeam BAS service, Veeam Data Cloud. And then we equally, for as long as we've had that data platform, maybe not as long, but since I've been here, we have the Veeam Cloud Service Provider, or VCSPs. And this is a list of service providers out there across the globe where they will offer Veeam as a service. Sometimes you don't even know that it's Veeam under the hood. But they will offload, like you do with the cloud, you can offload some of that responsibility of the data protection angle or the data resilience angle off to those. So where are we in terms of the Veeam Data Cloud? We have 3 areas in which you can consume today with that first party. We have Microsoft 365, the ability to offload that to a SaaS environment. We will protect it. We will store that and then provide you the ability to restore that in a granular fashion. Again, we can go into more detail about that later on. The ability to protect those Azure services that I just touched on through a as a service type model. And then if you're running Veeam on-prem, i.e. you're protecting virtual machines on a virtualization hypervisor, and you want to offload those into a first-party backup as a service, then Veeam Vault inside of the Veeam Data Cloud gives you that capability. It just looks like another repository where you store that data. And with that, hopefully that was useful. The key part of this was to highlight some of the areas that maybe we don't talk about enough. The native cloud solutions, the Kubernetes side of things, some of the main responsibilities that I have in the business. And I just, like I say, this started as a session for the Veeam User Group in the UK. And I just wanted to hit record, get something out there so that if anyone is interested, they can obviously take that on and have a play. The other thing to just finish on is that everything that I touched on, we have a community edition. Community edition on the Veeam Data Platform allows us to protect 10 instances. So that could be 10 virtual machines, that could be 10 physical machines. But that is a community edition that gives you free reign to do what you want on there. From a Kubernetes point of view, if you're running a Kubernetes cluster and you just want to see what casting can do, we enable 5 worker nodes free, fully functional from that perspective. So if you deploy a Kubernetes cluster, you've got the ability to protect those workloads, see what it can do, try out that mobility feature that I mentioned from one to another. But the only thing that I'll leave with is, please let me know if you'd like more detail. If you made it this far, please let me know those cloud services. We can go into more detail about what use cases are using those particular tools within the public cloud. We can dive deeper into the Kubernetes side of things. But yeah, you just let me know what we need to show. Awesome. Thank you very much.